I'd like to think that I'm a super fan of Thomas the Tank Engine, someone who grew up on the DVDs and VHSs, watched all the classic episodes, and listened to all the classic songs. And I enjoyed all of them for one reason or another, so I couldn't ever truly pick a favorite, and I don't think I ever will. Instead, what I want to do today is find the most definitive episode of Thomas, an episode I can say captures the essence of the Thomas universe and encapsulates the sort of values that the Thomas franchise has at its core. Of course, that is much easier said than done, so I want to go over some of the episodes I felt were really close to being the definitive episode before I tell you which one I picked. The first episode that came to mind, and I'm sure many of you thought of by now, is Edward's Exploit, which is absolutely an essential story overall. It is also a very defining moment for Edward as a character, as well as a love letter to the sentiments Audrey had towards steam during a time of dieselization. It is a story that touts steam engines as having the potential to triumph over adversity, and how the old can still surprise us all. There's no arguing that this isn't a great episode for the series and as a standalone story, but while it is certainly important, it feels like more of a character-defining moment and not quite what I was looking for as a series-defining story. I would also like to extend this thought process to similar stories like Gallant Old Engine, Four Little Engines, and even Percy's Promise, all episodes I dearly love, but just not the stories I felt captured what Thomas means to me. Another great contender for this title was Bulldog, another amazing adventure in its own right, with great characters and even some harrowing action. But like Edward's Exploit, the story revolves around an older character defying expectations, specifically Duke, saving the arrogant Sir Handel who thinks he knows better. This story is certainly closer to what I wanted because it has more to do with a character learning their lesson, which is a recurring element in the writing of Thomas, but there was something still missing here that kept me from picking this one with absolute certainty. The last contender was probably the most exciting story to think of, that being Escape. Such a major story for the Thomas universe as a whole. I mean, the premise is rescuing an engine from scrap, and having that be the introduction to the newest character, Oliver. It deals with some of the most central themes of being an engine on Sodor: modernization, scrap, and most of all, community and friendship. Of course, this episode should stand out for all of these reasons, along with the fact that it never even features Thomas, something you'll never see nowadays. I also think it's really interesting for not having that much of an explicit moral message, mostly because it functions as an introduction to Oliver as stated, and while that is very unique, unfortunately it means I can't call this the definitive episode. So let me make the case for the episode that I feel defines the Thomas the Tank Engine franchise. One that I feel showcases the morals of the series, gives us an understanding of the essential characters, and encapsulates the heart of the series. With this criteria in mind, I'd like to explain why Down the Mine is the definitive Thomas episode. A story you're very likely familiar with one way or another, and one that I feel does everything a Thomas episode should, in terms of plot, character, and themes. Not to mention there's even a little bit of action.
Fire and smoke, said Thomas. I'm sunk. And he was.
So let's begin with a synopsis. After Gordon's incident with a ditch, Thomas takes to teasing him, which is really just beating him while he's down, much to Annie and Clarabelle's embarrassment. Gordon is left feeling worse, while Thomas leaves feeling pleased with himself. We later see him shunt trucks at the mines and further act on his inflated ego as he decides to deliberately disobey a danger sign. He cheers and laughs as he pushes himself forward, thinking he's being very clever, which ultimately results in him falling, well, down the mine. Naturally, the only one able to rescue him is Gordon, who is delighted to hear of his incident, and with a great effort, Gordon pulls Thomas out, who feels very ashamed after everything. Gordon accepts Thomas's apology and admits that he is ashamed too, and the two engines recognize each other. Gordon proposes the two form an alliance and work together under the maxim, united we stand, together we fall. Now, I'm going to pull an unlucky tug and do some comparisons between eras and how the episode is represented in each respectively. So first, we will look at the Railway series, then the Model series, then the CGI series. And you'll see what I mean when we get there. We can then review each for its strengths and weaknesses and compare and contrast. After that, though, I want to get into why this episode matters and why it is the definitive episode for the series. So let's start with the first ever published version of this story, within the Railway series. Released as the third story in the book, Gordon the Big Engine, the eighth book in the series at that point, the book as a whole naturally revolves around the big man himself, starting with Gordon's aforementioned ditch incident that leaves him in disgrace. And as for the rest of the book, we follow the events that lead to his eventual redemption. The story of Down the Mine finds Gordon still feeling ashamed despite helping James in the previous story, and what's worse, being teased relentlessly by Thomas. After Thomas's accident at the mines, Gordon is sent to rescue him, and while he does find it funny, instead of rubbing it in his face or gloating, he puts it behind him and extends an olive branch by forming an alliance. This is very important to keep in mind. The story on its own is entirely capable of showing us the fundamental morals of Audrey's writing, the concepts of ego and comeuppance, the latter being a staple of the Thomas series, as well as most children's media. Both are core parts the series seeks to instill, since, after all, Wilbur Audrey grew up listening to and reading Christian moral stories, which often followed the same structure of a character doing something wrong or thinking in such a way that deserves a comeuppance falling upon them one way or another. Naturally, those ideas carried over to his own writing for children. His goal, however, was more to insert more of his own interests and personality into each story, not just with railways, but with people he has known in his life. Gordon, for example, took inspiration from a boy he knew who was bossy, and was actually named Gordon.
I called Gordon
Yeah.
after a small boy, whose name actually was Gordon, who used to play with my small son. He was a bossy type.
Yeah.
And so Gordon, as a name for a bossy engine, was a natural.
Be careful now, he might well sue you for that, you know.
And as the entire book shows us, this flaw in Gordon leads him to get stuck in a ditch, just as Thomas's flaw leads him down a mine. However, unlike some stories where the delinquent is punished at the end of the story and that's all there is, here we see a very interesting dynamic between the protagonists. Gordon acknowledges his failure, and when he sees that the same mistake is made by Thomas, uses it as an opportunity to allow them both to grow. I'd also like to mention that, where I didn't choose the stories like Edward's Exploit and Bulldog for their themes of the old still having merit, according to the timeline, Gordon and Thomas are both in their youth here, which leaves them on a relatively equal footing before they are both in disgrace, adding a layer to the relationship that is developed here. The importance of this story comes from the alliance that the two strike at the end, as it directly impacts the next story, where the two come to Stratum Hat as more humbled engines who want to do better. Obviously, because this is Gordon's book, he has gone through a bit more to make him feel in disgrace, living without his express for both this story and the one preceding it, and yet has had to put his ego aside to help another engine twice without expecting a reward. Looking at this version, I think this gives you the most complete experience due to the fact that the whole book provides the complete context for Gordon's arc. With this lens, the story of Down the Mine feels the most whole, as it is not only an important beat for Gordon's story, but it gives crucial development for Thomas and Gordon's relationship that reflects the bigger ideals of this world as a whole, that being the goals of helping and caring for one another, something I also go a little more into in my last video about the sad story of Henry, which you should totally watch. I'd also like to mention something I learned from a video Thomas Theorist did on Audrey's writing, that Audrey made sure to keep every story concise and made sure every word counted. I think this drives home how important the ending to the story is, with its final lines, "United we stand, together we fall," that come after the events of all three stories in this book. After everything Gordon has gone through, the fact that he is the one saying this speaks volumes for his growth as a character. Now for the model series version of the story. There are a few things to discuss. One thing I will say first is that, yes, I know this was supposed to be the original elusive pilot episode, and that is its own discussion. But that has nothing to do with the story itself, so let me be clear that the fact that it was the pilot episode has no impact on why it is the definitive Thomas episode. If we knew why the team originally chose this as the pilot, that could be another story. Although it is interesting that the episode Thomas and Gordon was chosen as the actual pilot, because I think their dynamic is an important reason for this episode's significance. So let's get to the meat of the discussion. There are some differences between the two versions that range from big to small. The smaller changes include simple changes in phrasing such as, Gordon snorted, but before he could answer, Thomas puffed away quickly.
Before Gordon could answer, Thomas puffed away.
The show also cuts extraneous things like whispered Thomas loudly in between dialogue, likely to cut down for time and because it was unnecessary in a show where you can see who is talking at that moment. And let's not forget the little changes made between the British and American dubs that use different railway terminology like truck and car. Some of the more major changes include adding lines like,
Not long ago, he had fallen into a dirty ditch. Thomas enjoyed teasing him about it.
and more drastically, they made a lot of cuts to the ending of the episode. Again, it is mostly extra dialogue, but they did cut the line "United we stand, together we fall" and simply left "You help me and I help you." The scene works, and the story as a whole still hits all the major points, and I think it's clear these cuts are made only for time's sake, and there are cuts that do help to get things across more simply, which is fine and doesn't detract anything at all, but I think it does give the episode its own separate identity from the books. Speaking of separate, I think the inclusion of a line that explains Gordon falling into a ditch is a byproduct of the nature of the show, which is to have a general continuity but have the episodes stand out on their own, unlike the books that compile 4 stories that are all directly connected to one another. Although, to mention the sad story of Henry again, this story does have a sequel in both the books and the show in the form of Paint Pots and Queens. And interestingly, where the book gets right into it, the episode of Paint Pots, which is also in season 4, 3 seasons after Down the Mine, takes the first full minute to explain everything that has led up to that point, going over Gordon and Thomas's respective mishaps, and even including the line "United we stand, together we fall." Also, as a funny aside, they say it all happens in the same day, which I never got from the book. I think these stories can all take place sometime apart from each other, because I find it really hard to believe that that would all happen in the same day. Anyways, I have no idea why they decided to do this story so long after the previous ones in the show, as it does make the intro feel a lot more disjointed and exposition heavy, unlike a lot of other episodes. Another major difference is also the most obvious one. This is a television episode. It uses props, sets, and audio to bring to life the story from the books. I mean, this seems almost unnecessary to point out, but this medium does add different elements to the story that weren't there before. One thing that always stuck out to me was when Thomas is shown in the mine, we can see a single tear forming in his eye, and while this is something that could have easily been added to the illustrations, the fact that it is unique to the show adds to the weight of the moment, and you can see that Thomas genuinely feels sorry. Of course, because there are so many more elements contributing to the final product, the crash Thomas has in the mine is much more impactful and memorable. This scene is the main event of the episode and represents the turning point for Thomas's character in the story in learning humility. Bottom line, while making many changes, the episode of Down the Mine keeps to the core of the original and shows it also works as an independent story, as well as a good adaptation of the book, while maintaining its own identity. If you remember, I did say that we would go over the version in the CGI series, and yes, let me clarify, they did not remake the whole episode of course, but they did reference it a number of times, starting in the movie Blue Mountain Mystery, where the engines are all discussing some of their biggest mistakes, like the sad story of Henry. Okay, I'm done mentioning it. Thomas tells the story of him falling down the mine shaft and feeling bad about it afterwards, and ultimately, that's all it comes down to. That, as well as the subsequent throwaway lines that mention it. What bothers me here is that in the movie scene, we don't get any input from Gordon on this at all, and there isn't any mention of Thomas and Gordon's connection from this anecdote either, which I feel is a real missed opportunity since Thomas and Gordon are the two characters who get some of the most focus in the show, especially in the CGI series. I know it's only supposed to be a neat callback, and it serves its purpose for the scene, but like a lot of the fan service in the CGI series, it kind of feels reductive and loses the substance that was once there. Obviously, this is a more inoffensive example, and it is nice to see Thomas falling down the mine recreated in full animation. I would like to think that the fact this story is referenced multiple times in the later years of the show helps to illustrate the significance the story has on the franchise as not just an iconic moment or crash, but as a defining story for the two most famous characters on the show. While this story clearly has value as a character-driven one, as well as providing an iconic crash, I still felt there was more I needed in order to classify this story as the definitive Thomas tale. In order to do that, I wanted to look at how this story represents the moral stance Audrey has with his writing and fulfills the values he wanted to pass on to his readers. We've talked a great deal about the concepts of ego and comeuppance and how that is often the center of these stories, but I also wanted to research why we tell stories and teach morals through them to help understand how they contribute to children's media, which I think in turn will help us understand Audrey's intentions. Some of the reasons I've found for why we feel the need to instill morals in children through stories or fiction have a lot to do with the responsibility we have to children to teach them, and those means can take the form of fiction. There are some who posit that the values in the stories help children grow into responsible citizens. Another lens we can take is understanding that Audrey's stories were never overly complex, meaning when someone like Thomas disobeys a danger sign, he has to learn his lesson by falling down a mine and get scolded by Sir Topham Hatt. Because children are not psychologically mature enough to distinguish right and wrong, and stories help them better understand certain real-life situations. That, and they also respond to authority figures. His stories have to fulfill this resolution not out of some obligation for a formula, but because of the desire to contribute something through one story, by instilling in readers that actions have consequences. Down the Mine is a story about comeuppance as well as relationships, and while folktales, folklores, fairy tales, and other types of children's media teach moral values, humor, ethics, and decision-making, as many other Thomas stories do, I feel this story is representative because it meets all of those values that these other stories follow, as well as including the growth that these two have as characters at the end. The morals in this story work on two levels, one being to listen to danger signs, of course, which can be understood by younger children, and the second lesson is that you shouldn't make fun of someone, but try to make amends, which can be understood by children who are a little older. The resolution of this story, where the alliance is formed, can be seen as an example that assists children in correlating real-life situations and themselves, and accept certain harsh realities of life and help better understand relationships. One of those harsh realities is that, like Thomas, other children will tease, and while that can be upsetting, it is accurate to reality, and helps cement the idea that taking the higher road and helping someone despite how they treated you can be its own reward. To add on, a story like this where the characters are made to feel as real or natural as possible in their behaviors helps because children attempt to relate to the stories, situations, characters, and circumstances to themselves and real-life situations. I think authors like Audrey knew this, which is why he used the boy he knew as the inspiration for Gordon, because we all know a Gordon, or a Thomas, and by making that connection with his readers, Audrey makes his stories easier to understand and relate to. We as people must inherently understand this about ourselves. When we tell each other stories, we don't just offer information, we offer emotions and ourselves in those stories. This applies to fictional stories we make up as well. They still come from a part of us that give new perspectives or ways of understanding ourselves, whether that be through fictional humans or anthropomorphized objects. So long as we continue to insert ourselves into those stories, there is something to take away from them. As Marson states, folktales and fairy tales are intended to instill good teachings and values in children from an early age. Henceforth, during Gurukul teachings in India, gurus or teachers will teach their disciples through storytelling. Storytelling is something we never stop doing as we grow older, but to author a story for public consumption like this must mean there is a desire to contribute a message more universal on top of the other ones. While I think we know that storytelling provides a myriad of lessons and other information for audiences of any kind, it is also shown that the moral content of stories can influence children's subsequent behavior. Vandenplas Halper et al. Found that hearing stories with altruistic protagonists made children more likely to help needy peers. Lee et al. Also showed that after hearing stories in which the protagonist benefits from being honest, children were less willing to lie. Of course, I can't tell you that watching or reading these stories is more likely to make a child honest, but given that we know children relate more to characters who are like them, ones who are flawed, and stories that have altruistic protagonists can influence their actions, I think this story has both of those attributes in spades, as both protagonists admit to their shortcomings and choose to make amends. And as we have talked about, Gordon chooses to help Thomas despite his teasing, which shows an altruistic resolution to the story. One study suggests children who watched pro-social programming and did roleplay afterward were more likely to choose pro-social behavior than those who watched neutral shows. By exposing children to examples of this kind of altruism, we can see the function of the television text in regulating, but by no means determining, the spectator's capacities for connectivity with distant others. It is this relationship that we need to critically analyze in order to understand just how public action on distant suffering may become possible in and through mediation, challenging the existing hierarchies of place and human life that the media help to reproduce. And as Audrey's writing shows us, this kindness may not always be found in perfect places, but it is through the act of reaching out like Gordon does that we may find those connections. And when children see that overcoming teasing like Gordon does is possible, they might be able to apply that to their experiences. But children aren't the only ones who gain from reading literature written for them. As one paper by Bouley and Godfrey adamantly claims, we have found that getting responses from students that display emotional competence is much easier if we use children's literature as the vehicle as opposed to the required readings that are more theoretical and analytical in content. Audrey always intended for his work to be appreciated by the adults reading with their children as well as the children themselves. So I imagine his books would elicit many emotional responses as well, because he thought of his audience this way. The paper cites one of the students who said, "It feels good to be treated as an equal, and not looked down upon, and to be read children's literature instead of Harvard graduate authored texts that serve no purpose because of their impossible vocabulary." And as the paper adds on, reading our students' children's literature liberates them to be childlike again, and gives them the permission to open their hearts and thus their minds. As someone who wrote my college thesis paper on Thomas the Tank Engine, I can say I definitely feel validated for one thing, but also agree that college readings are often oblique, which makes reading children's literature feel like a breath of fresh air. And the connection I have made or even remade to these characters by immersing myself in these books and episodes is also much more fun to do because they are so approachable. By using real-life inspirations and allowing for children to connect more to the content, Audrey makes it possible for those children to come back when they are older and still enjoy these stories and even enjoy them in new ways. I think this all relates to the center of this section. Why do we write stories? And while we have discussed the many psychological benefits as well as the many proposed reasons stories help children, I'd also like to end this section with some consideration for the philosophical reason we do it. As Judith Langer writes, inherent in the active literacy understanding is the promise of touching the many-sidedness of human sensibility. It is through the envisionments we develop as we explore new horizons of possibility that we can at least begin to imagine the perspectives or others in other circumstances, eras, and cultures, and be moved to make a new sense of ourselves, our times, and our world. The Railway series as a whole always stood out to me from the show because it always had more of an ensemble cast that gives us so many perspectives that help flesh out the world of living engines. It is through these stories we can learn of many things, from railway practice or history, but at the core of these stories are the morals that Audrey seeks to instill in his readers by showing us ourselves in the characters. As all stories should understand, it is through these flaws that we come to love these characters just as much as their virtues, and most importantly, the relationships they can cultivate are born from being able to understand each other despite those flaws. For it is through every story that we can live, learn, and learn to live. There are many stories that I think represent the best of the Railway series, as well as the Thomas franchise in general. Adventures of overcoming adversity, of trust, and of friendship. Yet the reason Down the Mine sticks out to me is because it is at its core a tale of friendship, but a friendship that is only found when the two characters reach their lowest points, figuratively and literally, when both have to let go of their egos so they can come together and work as allies. The crash may be exciting and the story may be short, but the message is still sweet, and like the characters, reflects a lot about ourselves. We may see ourselves as invincible like Thomas, or undeserving of what we want like Gordon and his Express, but when we can look past the seemingly desirable to extend an olive branch to others, we can find rewards just as gratifying. And that is why I believe Down the Mine is the most definitive story. But please, let me know which story you think defines this series, and why. I'd love to hear it. Anyways, that's all I've got. Goodbye.